I want to preface this by saying that what I'm about to describe is something I've only told two people in my life: my therapist and my older brother. Neither of them had a satisfying explanation. I don't expect you to either. I'm not telling this because I want answers anymore. I'm telling it because carrying it alone for this long has its own kind of weight. 3 years ago, I was living in Northern California. I had just finished my undergraduate degree and was in that strange, suspended period that happens after graduation when the structure you've lived inside for 4 years suddenly disappears and you're left figuring out what comes next. I had a part-time job at a landscape company. I was living with two roommates in a rental house that was fine, but not somewhere I wanted to spend more time than necessary. A friend of mine, I'll call him Derek, suggested a long weekend trip to the mountains. He had connections through his family to a cabin property near a small community in Plumas County, not a resort area, not the kind of place tourists generally find. A cluster of maybe a dozen cabins along a road that dead-ended at a trailhead. Most of them were privately owned and used seasonally. The area had been popular decades ago and had gotten quieter over the years as people sold off properties or stopped coming. Derek said the cabin had been in his family for years. His uncle owned it and rarely used it anymore. He had gotten permission for us to stay for 3 nights. There would be 4 of us total. Derek, myself, a girl named Priya, who Derek had been seeing for a few months, and my roommate, Joel. We drove up on a Friday afternoon. The road into the community was narrow and wound through pine forest. The cabins we passed looked mostly closed up. Shuttered windows, empty driveways, that specific stillness of places that are only occasionally inhabited. 1 or 2 had signs of recent use. Wood smoke from a chimney, a car in a driveway, but mostly it felt like we had the area to ourselves. Derek's uncle's cabin was at the far end of the road. It was larger than I expected. 2 stories, a covered porch that wrapped around the front, a stone fireplace visible through the front window. It had clearly been well maintained at some point, but showed signs of being left alone for a few seasons. Leaves had accumulated on the porch. A section of gutter had come loose on one side. We unloaded the cars and Derek got the heat going, while Joel and I checked out the property. There was a small shed behind the cabin, locked. A fire pit area with log seating. A narrow footpath leading into the trees that Derek said connected to the main trailhead about a half-mile up. That first evening was relaxed. We made food, built a fire outside until it got too cold, moved inside and talked. Normal trip behavior, nothing worth remarking on. I slept well that night. The second day, 4 of us hiked the trail. It was a good day. Clear skies, good conversation, the kind of physical tiredness at the end that makes everything feel earned. We ate dinner early and were all fading by 9. It was Joel who noticed it first. We were sitting in the living room and he got up to use the bathroom down the hall. He came back looking slightly off. He stood in the doorway for a moment before coming back to sit down. I asked him what was wrong. He said probably nothing, but he thought he'd seen someone outside the bathroom window. The bathroom window faced the side of the property. It was small and positioned high on the wall, the kind of window that gives light, but not much of a view. Joel said he had glanced up at it while washing his hands and seen what looked like the upper portion of a figure standing outside. He said it was there for a second and then wasn't. Derek said it was probably a deer. The tree line was close on that side of the cabin. Joel said he knew what a deer looked like. Nobody said much after that. Priya changed the subject and the conversation moved on, but something had shifted in the room. I noticed that nobody suggested going back outside that evening. The fire pit stayed empty. We locked the front door earlier than we had the night before without anyone explicitly suggesting it. I went to bed around 11. My room was on the ground floor at the back of the cabin. One window facing the rear of the property. I lay in the dark and listened to the usual sounds of the building settling and the wind moving through the pines outside, and told myself that Joel had seen a deer or a shadow or nothing at all. Then I heard the door. Not the front door, the back. There was a back door off the kitchen that led to the rear of the property. I heard the handle move, not turn fully, just move. The specific sound of pressure being applied to a door handle from the outside. I lay completely still. It happened again. The same sound. Deliberate. Like someone testing whether the door was locked. I got up and went to the kitchen. I stood in the dark and looked at the back door. The handle was still. Outside the small window beside the door, there was nothing but darkness and the shapes of pine trees. I checked that the door was locked. It was. I stood there for another minute and heard nothing else. I went back to my room and did not sleep well. In the morning, I told Derek what I'd heard. He went and looked at the back door and the area outside it. He came back and said the ground near the door showed disturbance, not clear footprints. The soil was a mix of pine needles and hard dirt that didn't hold impressions well. But the pine needles closest to the door had been pressed down in a way that suggested weight. Something had been standing there. Derek called his uncle that morning. I was in the kitchen and could only hear one side of the conversation. At one point, Derek said, "You never mentioned that." And later, "How long ago?" And then just, "Okay." After he hung up, he was quiet for a minute. Then he told us. 2 years before our trip, another group had stayed at the cabin. Friends of a friend, people Derek's uncle had allowed to use the property as a favor. During their stay, they had reported similar things. Sounds at night. A figure seen near the tree line. One of them had found evidence that someone had been walking the perimeter of the cabin at night. They had reported it to the local sheriff's office. Nothing was found. No follow-up. Derek's uncle had not mentioned this when Derek asked to use the cabin. We left that afternoon. All 4 of us agreed without much discussion. We just packed and left. I've looked into that area since then. The community where the cabin was located had a history I wasn't aware of when we went. Decades ago, there had been a violent incident at one of the properties in that same cluster of cabins. The details are part of public record, and I won't get into them here. What I will say is that the incident had never been fully resolved. The complete picture of what happened that night was never established. I don't know if any of that connects to what we experienced. Probably it doesn't. Old crimes don't leave presences behind. That's not how the world works. But somebody walked the perimeter of that cabin while we were sleeping. Somebody tested the back door handle in the middle of the night. Somebody stood outside a small bathroom window while my friend was inside. Whoever they were, they knew the cabin was occupied. They came anyway. This is something I've gone back and forth about sharing, because it involves a real place, and I don't want to be irresponsible about how I describe it. So I'll keep the location general. This happened in Indiana. A trail system near a small town. The kind of place locals use regularly, and that doesn't get much attention from outside. I was visiting a college friend who lived in that area. She was someone I'd kept in close touch with after graduation, even though we'd ended up in different states. I was staying with her for a long weekend. She suggested the trail on the second day, because the weather was good and she walked it regularly with her dog. It was a well-maintained trail. Wooden bridges over a creek, marked paths, a small parking area at the trailhead with an information board. We went mid-morning on a Saturday, and there were a few other people around when we started. Families, a couple of solo walkers, normal weekend trail traffic. About a mile in, the other people thinned out. The trail curved away from the creek and went up through a wooded section that was quieter and more enclosed. My friend said this part always felt more remote than it actually was. The town was maybe 2 miles away, but you couldn't hear or see any sign of it. Her dog, a medium-sized mixed breed named Cass, started behaving strangely in this section. Cass was a relaxed dog under normal circumstances. My friend had described her as almost embarrassingly calm for a dog, the kind of animal that barely reacted to squirrels. On this section of the trail, Cass began pulling back on the leash. Not forward towards something, back, the way dogs move when they want to retreat. Her ears were down. My friend had to coax her forward. I noticed a man on the trail ahead of us. He was standing on the wooden bridge that crossed the creek at the far end of this wooded section. Just standing on it, not looking at the water, not adjusting gear or checking a phone. Standing and looking back along the trail in our direction. At us. My friend noticed him at the same time. She said quietly that she didn't recognize him and she knew most of the regulars on this trail. He wasn't dressed for hiking particularly. Dark jacket, jeans, no bag, no water bottle, nothing that would indicate he'd planned to be out here for any length of time. We kept walking because stopping would have felt strange. As we got closer, he still didn't move. He just watched us approach. Most people on a trail, when you're walking toward them, eventually look away, adjust, step to the side to let you pass. He didn't do any of that. My friend said a casual hello as we reached the bridge. He didn't respond. Not a nod, not a word. He watched us walk past him. I felt the back of my neck do something I'm not able to describe precisely, except to say that every animal instinct I had was sending the same signal. We kept walking at the same pace until we were past the bridge and around a bend where he was out of sight. Then my friend said, "We're going back." Not as a question. She turned around and we walked back the way we came at a pace that was just short of running. At the bridge there was nobody. The man was gone. The bridge was empty. The trail in both directions was empty. We got back to the trailhead and got in her car and left. On the drive back, my friend told me that she had, without thinking about it, taken her phone out during the encounter and taken a photo. She said she didn't even remember deciding to do it. Her hand had just done it. She showed me the photo. He was in it. Standing on the bridge, facing the camera, watching us. She sent that photo to the local police department that afternoon. She filed a report describing the encounter. She included the photo. She never heard back from them. She doesn't walk that trail anymore. She found a different route for Cass. She told me once that what bothered her most wasn't the encounter itself, but the speed with which he disappeared. The trail behind us had been visible for a good distance when we turned around. He had been there 30 seconds earlier. There was nowhere he could have gone that quickly. The photo is still on her phone. She's never deleted it. She told me she's not sure why she keeps it. I think I understand. Some part of her wants proof that she didn't imagine it, that the thing she felt on that bridge was responding to something real. It was. I need to start with some context, because without it, the story doesn't make complete sense. I drive long distances alone regularly. I grew up in a military family and we moved often. which meant road trips were just part of life. I'm comfortable on interstates at night in a way that a lot of people aren't. I know the rhythms of long drives. I know which rest stops are well lit and which ones feel wrong the moment you pull in. You develop a sense for it after enough miles. The rest stop where this happened was in rural Texas. I was driving from New Mexico back to Louisiana where I was living at the time. It was a route I had done before. The rest stop was one I'd used on a previous trip. Clean, well-maintained, the kind of state-operated facility that has vending machines and a covered picnic area and usually has at least a few other travelers around. I pulled in around 2 in the morning. There were 3 other vehicles in the lot. A semi with its running lights on, engine idling, driver presumably sleeping. A minivan with dark windows. A sedan parked near the far end of the lot. I used the facilities and came back out. The night was warm, dry, the kind of Texas night where the stars are very visible because there's nothing around to compete with them. I stood by my car for a minute before getting back in. After 4 hours of driving, you want a moment that isn't moving. That's when I noticed the door. The women's restroom building had 2 entrances. The main entrance I had used and a secondary entrance on the side. That secondary door was propped open, not fully open, maybe 6 inches, just enough to notice. I stood there looking at it for a moment. There was no reason for that door to be propped open at 2 in the morning. The night was warm, but the facility was air-conditioned. Propping a door open would only work against that. Something felt wrong about it. I got in my car. I told myself I was tired and reading into things. I started the engine and pulled toward the exit. My headlights swept across the building as I turned, and for 1 second, 1 full second, I saw someone standing inside the propped door. In the gap. Standing in the dark of the side entrance, looking out at the parking lot. Completely still. I could not make out a face. The interior of the building was too dark, and the gap was too narrow. What I could see was a figure, standing in a doorway that should not have been open, in a building that should have been empty, at 2 in the morning, watching the parking lot. I left. I was back on the interstate within 30 seconds. I drove without stopping for the next 2 hours. I told myself what I'd seen was a cleaning staff member, a maintenance worker, someone who had a legitimate reason to be there. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. The women's restroom facility at that rest stop was not a large building. I had been inside it 30 seconds before I got in my car. There had been nobody else inside when I was there. I would have known. There was nowhere to stand that I wouldn't have seen. Whoever was standing in that doorway had not been inside the building when I was. They had come in after me and positioned themselves at the secondary exit facing the parking lot, watching which car I walked to. I reported it when I got home. I called the Texas Department of Transportation and described the rest, stopped by its mile marker, and described what I had seen. The person I spoke to was polite and took down my information and said they would pass it along to the appropriate department. I don't know if anything came of it. I never followed up. By the time I got home, I'd already started second-guessing my own memory the way you do when you're exhausted. And something has scared you, and you want very badly for it to have a normal explanation. But I know what I saw in those headlights. Someone was standing in that doorway. They had waited for me to leave the building and come back to my car, and they had watched from the gap in that door to see exactly where I went. I've driven through that stretch of Texas twice since then. Both times I passed that rest stop without pulling in. Both times I watched it in my rearview mirror as I went by. I don't stop there anymore. I don't stop at any rest stop alone at night anymore. Some habits form because something tried to happen, and you were lucky enough to leave before it did.